I shouldn't have checked my phone. That's the thought that keeps spinning in my head even now, months later. It was just a glance, right after I passed the old rusted sign that read, Obsidian Peak Trail Final Ascent. I was 3 days into a solo wilderness trip, feeling invincible. I had that hiker's high, sun-drenched, exhausted, and feeling like the only person left on Earth. The trail was a steep ribbon of switchbacks, carved into the side of a mountain that topped out at 12,000 feet. It was perfect. That's when I stopped for a water break. I pulled out my phone, which I kept off to save battery, just to check the time and take a quick photo of the ridiculously blue sky. But when the screen lit up, there was a single cryptic text message that somehow, impossibly, had slipped through the non-existent reception. Nice hat. Hope you packed enough water for the climb. My heart dropped into my stomach like a stone. I didn't recognize the number. My hat, a distinctive bright red baseball cap, was tucked under the hood of my fleece, which I had just pulled up 5 minutes ago because of the wind. How did they know? I tried to tell myself it was a delayed message, maybe from a friend I'd told about the trip, making a generic joke. But the timing, right after I'd pulled up the hood, was too specific, too instant for this elevation. I stuffed the phone back into my pack and scanned the trail behind me. Nothing, just the endless, winding path I'd already climbed. Above me, the switchbacks were empty, leading up to the black, jagged peak. Must be the elevation getting to me, I muttered, but my hands were already shaking as I clicked my trekking poles forward. I stopped enjoying the view. I started clocking distances, counting minutes between landmarks, and listening not to the wind, but to the silence. About an hour later, I reached a stretch of trail that flattened out slightly, running alongside a sheer rock face. There was a small, well-worn indentation in the dirt near an old pine, like someone had stopped there recently. Next to it, half buried by the trail dust, was a single cigarette butt. I don't smoke, and this wasn't a popular trail. I picked it up, feeling a fresh wave of ice-cold panic. It was a specific brand, the kind my ex-boyfriend used to smoke, the expensive, foreign ones. I threw it down instantly, my mind racing. No, it couldn't be. He lived 2,000 miles away, he didn't even hike. But the seed of fear was planted. I started pushing my pace, trying to get to the next scheduled campsite, which was still miles away. I needed to see other people, a ranger, anyone. The worst part of a high-altitude hike is that you're always exposed. No matter how far I went, if I turned around, I could see the whole winding path laid out below me like a map. I kept glancing back, expecting to see a figure round the last bend, but the trail remained stubbornly empty. If they're following me, they're being incredibly careful. That night, I reached a small exposed plateau where I planned to camp, right beneath the peak. The sun had dipped and the temperature had plummeted, turning the air bone-dry and frigid. I set up my tent fast, trying to use the last bit of light. As I was staking the rainfly, I noticed something odd. Near the edge of the plateau, overlooking the valley, was a small, crudely built stone structure. Maybe a foot high, like a little observation ring. I hadn't noticed it on the map. I walked over and looked down. From this specific spot, you could clearly see the last 3 miles of the trail, including the exact indentation where I'd found the cigarette butt. Suddenly, I realized what it was. It wasn't natural. It was a hunter's blind, or maybe an observation post. Someone had been sitting here watching the trail, probably for hours. My stomach twisted. I walked back to my pack and pulled out my little solar-powered headlamp. I shined the beam over the rocks near the blind, searching for any sign of recent occupation. That's when I saw it. A small, flattened-out section of grass, and 2 neat, half-moon indentations in the dirt, exactly where someone would place their knees if they were setting up a tripod. A tripod. Had someone been taking pictures of me? The idea was suffocating. I went back to my tent and zipped the vestibule shut, feeling utterly exposed on that barren peak. I ate a cold dinner of nuts and dried fruit, too keyed up to boil water. Around 10 p.m., the wind died down, and the silence became a physical presence. A heavy, absolute void. Every tiny sound was magnified. The snap of my tent fabric, the ragged sound of my own breathing. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to rationalize it away. Maybe it was a wildlife photographer. Maybe the text was a glitch. Then I heard it. A single distinct scuff of a boot on rock, not the gravel and dirt of the trail, but the solid granite of the summit ridge, maybe 50 yards above my camp. I froze, gripping the neck of my sleeping bag. It was too quiet for it to be the wind-shifting rocks. This was a deliberate, controlled movement. Someone was awake. Someone was moving. I slowly, agonizingly, unzipped the zipper of my tent just enough to poke one eye out into the inky blackness. The moon hadn't risen yet, and the world was just shapes and shadows. I saw nothing for a full minute, but then, right near the crest of the summit ridge, something shifted. It wasn't a person walking. It was a faint, brief flicker of light, like the brief pinprick glow you get when a flashlight beam passes quickly over a piece of polished metal or glass. It happened again, slightly lower this time, and then a third time. They weren't moving closer. They were stationary. They were just watching the camp. The sheer, cold malice of it hit me. They knew I was there. They had waited until I was zipped into my fabric cocoon, surrounded by darkness, and then, only then, they had made their presence known. I pulled my knife from its sheath and held it tight under my sleeping bag. My mind raced. He knew I was isolated, exposed, and exhausted. I couldn't run down the path. I'd be seen the moment I stood up, and he could easily cut me off on the switchbacks. I needed to break line of sight now. I looked at the terrain. My tent was pitched right in the middle of the plateau, but about 20 feet to the north, there was a shallow, rocky drainage ditch, a kind of natural fold in the granite leading down the side of the mountain away from the main trail. It was rough, steep, and completely invisible from the peak. The stalker's biggest advantage was that he could see me. I had to ditch the tent, the one thing that pinned me down, and move in a direction he wouldn't expect. I worked with slow, agonizing stealth. I unzipped the tent just enough to slide out the crucial gear. My knife, my headlamp, kept off, my GPS communicator, and my water bottle. I left my pack and the tent exactly where they were, a decoy to show him I was still asleep. I then rolled myself out of the tent, foot first, keeping my body low to the ground. The cold air hit me, a shock that helped focus my frantic thoughts. I crawled on my belly toward the rocky lip of the plateau, dragging my few essential items with me. When I finally reached the drop-off, I slipped silently into the drainage ditch. The rocks were loose and unforgiving, cutting into my hands, but the sound of the wind, now rushing again in the narrow channel, masked the noise. I didn't try to go down. I started going across. I crawled sideways, parallel to the peak, hiding in the shadows of the rocks until I was maybe 100 yards from my empty tent. I finally stopped in the shelter of a massive boulder, hidden from the peak. I was freezing, alone, and miles from help, but I wasn't pinned down anymore. I risked a look back. I could barely make out the outline of my tent in the blackness. And then, I saw the motion. The faint flicker of light from the peak was gone. In its place, a steady, strong beam of light began to sweep across my former campsite. The stalker was coming down. He was searching. The light stopped, centering on my tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the granite I was leaning against. The light stayed fixed for a full minute, and then the beam dropped low, illuminating the ground around the tent. He was circling it. He knew something was wrong. Then, the light swung violently toward the empty space where I had been sleeping, stopping on the open, unzipped vestibule. He hadn't seen me leave, but he knew I was gone. The light beam swept around the plateau wildly, erratically, searching for any sign of movement. That was my chance. I turned my back on the light, put my headlamp on its lowest red setting, invisible from a distance, and started scrambling down the steep, rough drainage chute. It wasn't a path. It was a desperate vertical retreat, sliding down loose scree and jumping small ledges. I kept going until the plateau was just a dark, silent shadow high above me. I didn't stop to rest until the first, faint, gray light of dawn began to paint the horizon, miles below where I'd started. I had left my pack, my tent, and my fear up on that peak. All I had was my knife, a bottle of water, and a growing certainty that if I had stayed in that tent, I would not have seen the sunrise. Did he follow the drainage chute? Was he still up there, watching me descend? I never saw him again, but I knew one thing. I had made it out of his line of sight, and I had broken his meticulously set trap. I kept moving, not stopping until I flagged down a passing park ranger 7 grueling hours later. I never got my gear back. But I didn't care. The chilling question remains, did he give up or did he let me go? Knowing he'd already taken the one thing he really wanted, my peace of mind. I was hiking the long loop through the Red Mesa National Forest, an area known more for its remote emptiness than its scenic views. The official trails ran south, but I'd taken a less traveled rugged service road that followed Maple Creek, trying to shave off 10 miles. It was a mistake I almost didn't live to regret. The road was barely visible, just 2 faint tire tracks, swallowed by weeds and pine needles. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. A cloying, chemical smell that I couldn't quite place at first, like fertilizer mixed with stale sweat. It was mid-afternoon, quiet enough to hear the buzzing of flies 100 yards away. I was rounding a tight bend where the creek spilled over a mossy bank when I saw the equipment. It was haphazardly hidden behind a thicket of scrub oak. A large, olive-green canvas tarp, several stacks of empty 5-gallon buckets, and a coil of heavy-duty black hose disappearing into the brush. This wasn't standard camping gear. It looked industrial, out of place, and instantly suspicious. I should have turned around immediately, but my curiosity and maybe a flash of stupid arrogance pushed me closer. I dropped into a crouch and crept toward the thicket. That's when I saw the real sign. Someone had carved a crude, deep X into the bark of a large pine tree right next to the tarp. It wasn't a trail marker. It was a warning, a territorial boundary. Before I could back away, I heard the sound that turned my blood to ice, the sharp, metallic clank of something heavy being dropped, followed by low, intense voices speaking in hurried, clipped Spanish. They were nearby, very nearby. I didn't hesitate. I dropped flat onto my stomach, pressing my face into the pine needles and trying to disappear into the undergrowth. I could hear their footsteps now, heavy boots crunching on the gravel, getting closer to the cache. They were coming from the direction I needed to go. "Did you check the perimeter line?" One voice hissed, sounding agitated. "Yesterday. It's clean. Nobody comes this way, Jamie. Only deer and idiot tourists who stick to the main road." "Well, check it again. The pickup is due tonight. We can't have any trouble." I risked a slow millimeter-by-millimeter slide backward. My pack scraped against the ground, and the sound felt like a gunshot in the silence. I froze, my body rigid. The footsteps stopped. "What was that?" the second voice Jamie asked. Silence stretched, thick and painful. I held my breath until my chest burned. "Probably just a squirrel," the first man said dismissively, but his voice lacked conviction. I knew they were scanning the woods, right where I was hiding. If they found me, I wouldn't be an idiot tourist. I'd be a witness who stumbled upon a large-scale, illegal operation, a problem that needed to be permanently solved before the pickup arrived. I needed a distraction. Something loud enough to cover my retreat, but subtle enough not to reveal my exact location. My eyes landed on a loose pile of smaller rocks near the creek bank. I waited until their conversation picked up again, a little less cautious this time. Then, very slowly, I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up a grapefruit-sized rock. I threw it, not toward them, but hard, toward the opposite side of the creek, maybe 50 feet away, into a dense patch of rhododendrons. Crash! The sound was loud and unnatural, followed by the scattering of dry leaves. "Deer," Jamie shouted. "No, that's too heavy for a deer," the first man snapped. "Check the creek line. Split up. You go low, I'll go high." This was the terrifying break I needed. As their footsteps separated and headed toward the noise, I didn't get up and run. Running would be too fast, too obvious. I rolled over, crawled into the darkest, thickest rhododendron bush near the creek, and began inching my way along the water's edge, moving parallel to the road, but staying absolutely hidden in the bank's deep shadows. I was moving toward their location, then quickly past it, relying on the cover and their belief that the noise had come from the other side of the water. My adrenaline was spiking, and my mind was racing with terrifying possibilities. What if one of them circled back? What if they had a dog? I heard one of them, the higher voice, curse loudly, close enough that I could almost feel his proximity. He was right near the cache, looking away from me, checking the opposite side of the road and shining a flashlight, even in the daylight, checking for tracks. I was now crawling through a muddy, disgusting mix of cold water and slick moss. My clothes were soaked, but the creak masked the sound of my movement. I passed the thicket where the cache was hidden, noticing the metallic sheen of a few shovels and what looked like a satellite phone charging under the tarp. This was organized. These were not casual hikers. Finally, I reached a point where the creek bent sharply to the north, giving me a thick, tall embankment as cover. I risked standing up, bent low, and started moving as fast as my burning lungs would allow, keeping the dense bank between me and the criminal site. I hiked like a madwoman for the next hour, never once looking back. Every twig snap, every rustle of leaves convinced me that I heard their heavy boots gaining on me. When I finally connected back to the official marked trail, a wide gravel path used by park vehicles, I didn't slow down. I ran until I saw the first sign of civilization. A small, faded sign for a ranger station, still 2 miles away. I finally collapsed next to the sign, hyperventilating. I was covered in mud, scratches, and the smell of pine and dread. What would they have done if they had found me? They were waiting for a pickup, meaning they were expecting heavy money or product. I was nothing more than collateral damage. When I finally reached the ranger station, I found it closed. I used the emergency phone, a shaky, terrible connection, to call the police, relaying the exact location of the coordinates I'd snapped with my GPS communicator just before I threw the rock. I sat there, shaking, waiting for the authorities to arrive. I was alive, but the terror was permanent. I kept replaying the moment they stopped talking, when they knew something was wrong. I never found out what was in those buckets, or who those men were. All I knew was that I had crossed an invisible line into someone else's hostile territory, and only a single, well-aimed rock and a very cold creek had saved me from being permanently hidden in the remote emptiness of the Red Mesa National Forest. The listing had been vague, which I should have taken as the first warning sign. Historic fire lookout cabin, primitive, spectacular views, requires 4-mile hike on maintenance trail. I booked it immediately. A few days of isolation, books, and silence, that was the dream. The maintenance trail was overgrown and steep, and by the time I saw the cabin through the pines, the sun was already a bruised orange near the horizon. It was worse than primitive. It was abandoned looking, grayed wood, peeling paint, and the glass missing from one of the small square windows of the lower floor. But as I dropped my heavy pack by the steps, I noticed a detail that made my stomach clench. The front door, which should have been locked and waiting for my key, was cracked open about an inch. And next to the entrance, resting neatly against the jamb, was a pair of scuffed, heavy-duty leather boots. They were not mine. I froze. My breath hitched. Rationally, I told myself, maybe the previous guest forgot something and came back. But the cabin was 4 miles from the nearest road, and I was the only reservation for the entire week. I pulled my camping axe out of its sheath on my pack. It felt ridiculously small. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding shaky and pathetic in the still air. "Is anyone in here?" I reserved the cabin. Silence. Thick, heavy, oppressive silence. I took a deep breath, kicked the heavy boots away from the doorway, and slowly pushed the door open. The lower level was just a small storage room and a ladder leading up to the actual lookout post. The storage room was empty, save for some dusty old equipment and, right in the center of the wooden floor, a neatly placed pile of gear. An expensive, brand-new sleeping bag, a high-end gas stove, and a tactical backpack. This wasn't a forgotten guest. This was someone who was living here, and they had just stepped out. I scrambled up the rickety ladder to the lookout room. It was a single, dusty space with windows on all 4 sides, offering the promised spectacular 360-degree view. But the view wasn't what caught my attention. On the single wooden table in the center, there was a worn map of the surrounding mountains, my exact hiking map, but someone had drawn dark, thick red circles around 3 specific points. And next to the map was a small, high-powered 2-way radio, the kind used by forestry services. But this one was black, military grade. I leaned closer to the table, my fingers barely brushing the edge. That's when I heard the unmistakable heavy thud from the bottom floor. He was back. I spun around just as a voice, calm and deep, spoke from below the ladder opening. "You should have waited until morning to climb up, Sweet Pea. The stairs are pretty tricky in the dark." I gripped the wooden railing of the lookout deck, feeling the sweat on my palms. I could see only the top of his head, a man stocky with dark, unkempt hair. "I booked this cabin," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need you to leave." He chuckled, a low, unnerving sound. He slowly climbed the last 2 rungs. He was big, much bigger than he sounded. His eyes were cold and flat, and he wore a heavy canvas jacket even though it wasn't that cold inside. "I know you did," he said, nodding slowly. "That's why I'm here. See, this spot is perfect for me. Private, high up. But sometimes I need a little company to help pass the time, especially at night." He stepped off the ladder, blocking the only way down. I was trapped in a glass box, 15 feet off the ground, with him. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, raising the axe slightly. He barely glanced at the blade. "Waiting. Watching. And now, chatting. It gets lonely up here. I saw you coming up the trail about an hour ago. You walk fast." He smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "That's how I knew who you were, the fast hiker with the big blue backpack." My heart hammered against my ribs. He hadn't just arrived, he had been expecting me. He had booked out the cabin and was using my reservation as a lure. "I have a satellite messenger," I lied, though mine was in my pack downstairs. "I've checked in with my emergency contact. If I don't contact them by sunrise, they call the sheriff." He didn't panic. He just slowly walked over to the windows, inspecting the view. "See, that's the thing about this place. No cell service, no radio signals that matter. Only my radio works, because I tuned it. And your pack? That's downstairs with my boots. You think I didn't check for a fancy little emergency beacon?" He turned and looked directly at me. "I need you to relax. This is just a little detour for you. I need you to stay here with me until I'm ready to leave." He gestured to the table. "You saw the map. I have things going on down there," he said, tapping one of the red circles. "Things that require silence. Having a pretty little companion up here keeps me sane while I wait, and it keeps you safe, as long as you don't make any noise." He walked over to the heavy metal shutter bolted next to one of the windows. The light was fading fast. He unlatched it and slammed it shut, sealing off the window with a deafening clang. "No need to look out anymore," he said casually, moving to the next one. "It's going to be a long, dark night." I backed up until the wall was at my spine, my eyes darting between the ladder and the 3 remaining windows. The cabin was turning into a prison, and as the heavy shutters closed one by one, the sound intensified my fear. He was focused on the last window, wrestling with the rusty latch. I knew this was my only chance. My heavy boots were still downstairs by the main door, and I was wearing thick wool socks. Silent. As he finally yanked the final shutter closed, the sudden darkness enveloping the room, giving me a split second of blindness, I moved. Instead of trying to fight him or go down the ladder, I ran silently to the opposite side of the lookout room, where a large wooden trapdoor was bolted shut on the floor. It was meant for maintenance. I quickly dropped my axe, yanked my knife from my belt, and jammed the tip into the gap in the loose hinge bolts. I didn't try to unscrew them. I pried the whole assembly, jamming the hinge until it buckled and gave way. The trapdoor lifted with a loud, protesting screech that cut through the darkness. "What the hell was that?" he yelled, spinning around, his footsteps heavy and fast. I didn't wait. I dropped everything and dove through the opening. The trapdoor led not back to the main room, but to a sheer drop of about 10 feet onto the roof of the small, ground-floor storage shed attached to the cabin's exterior. I landed hard on the slick, mossy shingles, knocking the air out of my lungs, but the sound of my impact was immediately covered by the man screaming above me and the violent kick he delivered to the trapdoor to slam it shut. He didn't know where I was, only that I wasn't inside. I didn't hesitate. I rolled off the edge of the shed roof, hitting the soft, pine needle-covered ground with a dull thud. I was outside, in the dense, freezing darkness. I heard the frantic scraping of the ladder as he scrambled down from the lookout room. He would be out the main door in seconds. I didn't try to grab my pack or my expensive gear. They were his now. All I needed was distance. I ran blindly, barefoot in my socks, straight into the thickest, darkest part of the woods, away from the maintenance trail, away from the windows, and away from the terrifying, isolated prison he had prepared for me. The cold soaked into my feet, The trees whipped my face, and the sound of his furious bellowing shouts faded behind me. I kept running, fueled by the sheer knowledge that I had broken his rules, and he was now hunting me in the night he thought he controlled. How many people had he watched ascend that trail? I didn't know, but I knew I wouldn't be his company for the long, dark night. I was free, running on raw terror, praying I could make it back to the main road before he could find my tracks in the morning dew. The biggest mistake I made wasn't getting lost. It was trusting the first friendly faces I saw after I twisted my ankle. I was on a multi-day hike near the border of a state park and some rugged BLM land. I took a shortcut that involved scrambling down a steep, rocky ravine, and that's where my foot betrayed me. A sickening snap, and then white-hot pain. I knew instantly it was a bad sprain, maybe a break. I managed to crawl out onto a dusty, unmarked 2-track road where I sat for nearly 3 hours, shivering and trying to get a signal on my dead phone. Just as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky with impossible shades of orange, I heard the rumble of an engine. It was an old, beat-up pickup truck, the kind used on farms or construction sites, covered in red dust. Inside were 2 men. The driver, Pete, was barrel-chested with a thick, graying beard and kind eyes. The passenger, who introduced himself as Randy, was younger, quieter, with a nervous energy. "Well, look here," Pete said, stopping the truck and leaning out the window. "You look like you're having a bad day, miss. Foot hurt?" I felt a rush of pure, desperate relief. "I think I broke my ankle. I need to get to the nearest town, the clinic." Pete immediately opened his door. "Hop in the back. We're headed down to the valley anyway. It'll take us right past the clinic in Oak Haven. Don't worry about paying us back. It's the right thing to do." I was so grateful. I didn't question anything. I didn't question why their truck smelled faintly of gasoline and stale copper. I didn't question why they were way out here on an unmarked road. I just focused on the agony in my ankle as I managed to haul myself into the extended cab. They were friendly, maybe a little too friendly. They asked my name, where I was from, and how long I'd been hiking. The questions were casual, but they kept pressing for details about my life. Did anyone know exactly where I was? Was I traveling with a partner? Did I have family nearby? "No, just a solo trip," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "But I did check in with the park service at the trailhead. They know my itinerary." It was a complete lie, but I hoped it sounded like a good deterrent. Pete just grunted and turned the radio up, drowning out the rest of the conversation with static-laced country music. As the light completely failed, the temperature dropped, and we entered a narrow canyon. The road was terrible, winding and heavily forested. I kept watching the mile markers they occasionally passed, trying to gauge how far we were from Oak Haven. "How much farther is the town?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Randy, the quiet one, turned around to face me from the passenger seat. His eyes were wide in the dashboard light. "Oh, we aren't going to Oak Haven right now, miss." My stomach seized up. "What?" Pete said Oak Haven. Pete gripped the steering wheel tight. "Relax. We just need to stop at a friend's place first. It's right off the road, won't take more than 20 minutes. Then we'll drop you at the clinic. Don't be ungrateful." "I'm not ungrateful," I snapped, my voice rising with a panic I couldn't control. "But my ankle needs immediate attention. I need to go to the clinic now." The air in the cab became suffocatingly thick. Randy slowly reached into the center console and pulled out a flashlight. "Not to use, but just to hold." "See, that's the thing," Pete said, his voice now entirely devoid of the previous kindness. "We told you what you needed to hear to get you into the truck. You look like a hiker with expensive boots and maybe some valuable gear. You'll wait." The realization hit me like a physical punch. These weren't Samaritans. They were predators, opportunistic and cold. I wasn't being driven to a clinic. I was being driven to wherever they intended to hold me. I looked desperately for a way out. The doors were locked, and the truck was moving too fast on a winding, sheer road for me to risk a jump, especially with my ankle. I noticed a map crumpled on the floor near my feet. An old, detailed topographical map that looked like it had been used heavily. I risked leaning down, wincing from the pain in my ankle, and grabbed it, trying to unfold it subtly beneath the dim light of the cab. Randy saw me move. "What are you doing down there?" Just checking my ankle, I gasped, quickly shoving the map under my thigh. He turned back around, but his body language was tense. He was watching the reflection in the rear window. I spread the map out carefully beneath my thigh. We were on the County Road 402, and according to the map, it ended in about 5 miles at an old, abandoned mine site. But before that, there was one single, tight switchback marked with a small, hand-drawn circle and the letter J. This must be the friend's place. I have less than 5 minutes. I needed to slow the truck down, and I needed to create chaos. I reached into the small, zipped pocket on the side of my pack, which contained my emergency whistle and my pepper spray. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard I thought they could hear it over the radio. As we approached the marked switchback, a sudden, sharp 180-degree turn over a precipice, I knew it was now or never. I waited until Pete took the sharp corner. As the truck leaned heavily to the right, throwing my weight against the door, I pulled out the pepper spray. Instead of aiming for them, which would be impossible with my position and the seat backs, I aimed high. I sprayed a massive cloud of the chemical directly into the HVAC air intake vent, which was located right at the center of the dashboard near the windshield. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. The spray was immediately sucked into the ventilation system, blasting the extremely concentrated irritant straight into their faces. Pete screamed, a choked, guttural sound, as he was instantly blinded. Randy yelled, grabbing his own face, "My eyes! Stop the truck!" Pete shrieked, slamming his foot down. He slammed the brakes, hard. The truck swerved violently, its tires spinning on the gravel, and slid toward the edge of the precipice on the outside of the switchback. In that half-second of screaming chaos, I threw open my door, ignoring the agony in my ankle. I stumbled out, falling hard onto the dusty road. I scrambled up and started dragging myself on my hands and one good foot down the road, away from the truck. Behind me, I heard the engine rev, then the grinding sound of the tires trying to regain purchase. They were coming for me. I pulled myself behind a massive, moss-covered oak tree, just as the headlights cut through the darkness. The truck, still running, slowly crept around the corner. They didn't see me. They were still blinded and coughing, furious and disoriented, but they were driving past, heading toward the abandoned mine site marked on the map. They were committed to their destination, assuming I was somewhere farther down the road. I waited until the sound of the engine was just a faint echo in the canyon. Then, still shaking violently, I used my knife to cut away a sleeve from my fleece, wrapping it as a makeshift compression bandage around my throbbing ankle. I was alone, injured, and miles from civilization, but I wasn't trapped in the back of that truck. I had escaped the false rescue. I didn't try to go back the way we came. I didn't know if they would return. Instead, I grabbed a heavy rock and started crawling and hopping painfully back in the direction we'd just come from, toward the slight chance of rescue, knowing that my saviors tonight were my own paranoia and a cheap can of pepper spray. I knew I had hours of agonizing travel ahead, but every painful yard was a step away from the terrifying trap I had just shattered. I was off trail, which was stupid, but I needed to be. I was tracking a specific geological feature, a rare band of schist that cut through a remote, unmapped section of the state forest, and the only way to get to it was to bushwhack. I had my heavy boots, my GPS, and my confidence. That last one lasted until about 2:30 p.m. I was stepping over a dense patch of mountain laurel, focusing on keeping my balance on the steep, uneven ground, when my left ankle disappeared. Not into a hole, but into something that grabbed it with a sickening, instantaneous tightness. The pain was so immediate and overwhelming that I screamed, falling forward and slamming my knee onto a sharp rock. I lay there for a minute, panting, the smell of crushed leaves and adrenaline filling my nostrils. When the white noise of the pain receded, I looked down. A loop of thick, braided steel cable, maybe a 1/4 inch thick, was cinched tight around my boot and lower calf. The cable ran down and disappeared into the dirt, anchored to something heavy and unseen. It wasn't a bear trap, but a professional-grade illegal hunting snare, designed to trap large mammals and hold them until they died of exhaustion or until the setter arrived. I wasn't just stuck, I was actively being strangled by metal. The cable was already cutting off circulation. My foot was starting to tingle with that horrible pins and needles feeling. I pulled, I twisted, I swore. The cable didn't budge. I reached for the small folding saw on my belt, but the cable was too thick, and trying to cut it in that confined space felt impossible. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate, cruel device set by someone who clearly didn't care about the rules of the national forest. I tried calling out, screaming until my voice was raw, but I knew the truth. I was so deep in the brush, so far off any known path, that my voice was swallowed immediately by the dense trees. I have to get out now. How long until the person who set this trap comes back to check their prize? I pulled out my satellite communicator. No signal. I was too deep in the canyon. All I had was my pack, my knife, and the growing terror that someone was already out there, listening for the sound of my panicked struggles. I spent the next hour frantically digging the anchor point out of the dirt with my bare hands. It was a heavy, flat steel stake driven deep. I managed to loosen the dirt around it, but I couldn't pull it free without risking more damage to my ankle. Exhausted, I leaned back against a wet log, trying to conserve my strength and think. The sun had begun its slow descent, and the forest was growing dim. That's when I heard it. A faint, repetitive sound, maybe 100 yards away, coming from the direction of a narrow, dry creek bed. It was the quiet, rhythmic sound of a trekking pole or a walking stick tapping against rock and wood. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was a person moving slowly, steadily, and deliberately through the brush. The trapper was coming. My breath caught in my throat. I instantly stopped digging. I wiped the mud from my face and tried to look composed. Maybe like a lost hiker who had simply taken a bad fall, not a frantic victim caught in a metal noose. The tapping sound grew slightly louder, occasionally punctuated by a branch snapping. He was definitely following the dry creek bed, maybe checking his line of traps. Closer now, perhaps 50 yards. I yanked my knife out. It was a useless defense against someone who was likely armed, but holding it was the only thing that kept me from fully collapsing into hysterics. I had one option. I had to make the area look deserted, or at least give myself a few minutes of warning. I quickly tore off my bright blue rain jacket and threw it hard, high up into the thick canopy of a nearby hemlock tree. It snagged on a branch, high above the ground. Then I crawled around the base of the log I was leaning against, pulling my body deep into the shadows beneath the dense mountain laurel. The snare cable stretched taut around my leg, burning with pain, but I forced myself to be silent. The only part of me that was exposed was the cable itself. Very close now. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, trying to make my presence invisible. I needed him to pass by, to see the jacket high up, assume the victim had somehow escaped or was struggling above, and move on. The footsteps stopped. Silence. The crushing, heavy silence of the forest when a predator knows it's close. I could hear his heavy breathing, and then the faint, sickening sniff of someone smelling the air. He was searching. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the subtle sound of movement, a boot scuffing the dirt right where I had fallen. Then a low, gravelly voice broke the silence. "Well now, look what we got here." He wasn't talking to me. I heard him walk slowly, deliberately, right past where I was hiding. He was looking up. He must have spotted the blue jacket. "You think you're clever, do you?" he muttered. I heard the sound of a stick snapping loudly, followed by a grunt of effort. He was trying to knock the jacket down. This is my chance. He's distracted and looking up. I pushed myself into action. The only way to escape was to release the spring mechanism on the snare. With my knife, I quickly sliced open my boot and the thick fabric of my pants around the cable. Then, ignoring the agony of the steel biting into my flesh, I reached into the dense undergrowth beneath the laurel and found the metal jaw and spring assembly of the snare, right where the cable went into the dirt. I jammed my knife blade into the tightly wound trigger spring mechanism, pushing with all my might. The blade bent, but then with a sharp, echoing twang, the spring gave way. The loop around my ankle instantly went slack. I pulled my leg free, scraping the skin off my calf but breaking the containment. Above me, the trapper heard the loud twang. "What was that?" he yelled, spinning around, finally looking down. I didn't try to stand. He was too close, too big. I pushed myself on my hands and knees, scrambling away from the ambush point, moving through the thick undergrowth on the opposite side of the log. He caught sight of my motion. "Stop right there, you little sneak." He took 2 running steps toward me, but he was slowed by the thick brush. I kept low, moving fast, dodging around the roots. I scrambled up the bank of the dry creek and saw the faint, reddish stain of my own blood on the green moss. I didn't stop. I found an old, steep deer path and started hauling myself up the grade. Behind me, he was thrashing through the brush, shouting now, the sound of his frustrated fury echoing through the quiet valley. I heard something metallic clank. Was it a weapon, or just his tools? I kept going until my lungs burned and my ankle throbbed with a rhythmic, blinding pain. I finally collapsed onto a massive outcropping of rock, hidden beneath a canopy of evergreens where I knew he wouldn't easily track me. I looked down at my bleeding, raw ankle. The snare had left a deep, purple gash, but it was free. I was immobile, terrified, and miles from help, but I had broken the trap. I was no longer the trapper's captured prize. I was loose in his territory, and he knew it. Would he give up on the prize, or would he follow the blood trail? I knew I couldn't stay. I ripped a strip of fabric from my ruined pants and tied it around the wound, then started the painful, slow crawl up the mountain, choosing evasion over survival, knowing that every minute I gained was 1 minute less under the gaze of the man who hunted humans for sport. The 3 of us, Liam, Sarah, and I, had been hiking partners for years, but this particular stretch of the Eagle Pass Trail was testing everyone's nerves. It was a week-long, aggressive trek through a largely unpatrolled wilderness area, and by day 4, the exhaustion was breeding paranoia. The troubles started not with a physical threat, but with a missing item, my personal GPS communicator. We had stopped for lunch at a small windswept ridge. I was tired, distracted, and when I went to put my pack back on, I noticed the side pocket where I kept the emergency beacon was unzipped. The device was gone. "Has anyone seen my Garmin?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "The orange one." Liam, who was meticulously repacking his gear, just shrugged. "No. Did you drop it on the ascent?" Sarah, who was sitting on a rock staring out at the valley, turned around slowly. "I saw you using it last night when you were checking the elevation. It was clipped to your pack." I went cold. It had been clipped on, but now the clasp was wide open. I hadn't used it all morning. It was expensive, but more importantly, it was our only reliable way to signal for help in this dead zone. I looked from Liam's indifferent face to Sarah's slightly too calm expression. We had been together every step of the way since we broke camp. Only one of them could have taken it, or seen who did. "Guys, this isn't a joke," I said, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "We are 40 miles from the trailhead. If something happens, we're blind." Liam finally stood up, his posture defensive. "Look, maybe it fell out. Stop looking at us like we stole it. We're all dependent on it." Sarah said nothing, just continued to stare at me with unsettling intensity. The air shifted immediately. The easy camaraderie of the trip evaporated, replaced by a suffocating suspicion. We continued the hike in silence, now walking separately, spacing ourselves out on the trail. Every turn was an opportunity for one of them to lag behind or move ahead, putting them out of sight. Later that afternoon, the trail descended into a deep, misty gorge. We had to set up camp early because the light was failing rapidly, and the air was thick with fog that muffled all sound. I chose a spot maybe 30 feet from their shared tent, putting a thick cluster of boulders between us. I was nervous about sleeping. I kept my knife and a small canister of bear spray right inside my sleeping bag, within reach. Around 10 p.m., I heard them arguing. It wasn't loud, but the wind was still and the fog carried the sound. Liam's voice, "You shouldn't have done that. It's too risky. We need her to trust us." Sarah's voice, low and furious. She was going to bail. She was talking about turning back after the second pass. This way, she stays focused. "We finished this, Liam." That was the deal. Then the voices dropped to an inaudible murmur. They were talking about me. They had a deal, and my communicator wasn't lost. It had been taken because I was a liability to their objective. What objective? What are they doing that requires getting this deep into the wilderness and silencing me? The terror wasn't just physical. It was the gut-wrenching realization that two people I trusted with my life were now actively conspiring against me. I lay rigid in my tent, my mind reeling. My fear turned into cold, calculating resolve. I knew I couldn't confront them. 2 against 1, and they clearly had some sort of scheme, maybe something dangerous they were hiding. I had to disappear without them knowing, until morning. Around 1 a.m., the moon broke through the fog, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the boulders. I heard the distinct sound of a zipper from their tent, followed by light footsteps moving away. I slowly and silently unzipped my tent just a crack. It was Sarah. She was carrying something dark and heavy, maybe a duffel bag, and she was heading up the trail toward a high, jagged prominence known as the Sentinel Point. She was clearly making a delivery or a drop-off under the cover of the night, and Liam was covering for her. I waited until her figure was swallowed by the dark pines. I knew I couldn't carry my full pack. The weight would slow me down, and the movement would be too loud. I grabbed the essentials: water, my knife, the bear spray, and my emergency blanket. I left my tent and my large pack behind, just like I did in the first story, using it as a decoy. I crept over to their tent, moving through the soft moss and wet leaves. Liam was still inside. I could hear his heavy, even breathing, a classic sign of someone faking deep sleep. He was awake, waiting for Sarah to return. I saw their cooking gear stacked neatly outside their vestibule. Crucially, I saw their large bottle of stove fuel, white gas, highly flammable. With painstaking care, I used my knife to pierce the plastic fuel bottle in several places, letting the highly volatile liquid slowly seep into the ground around their tent. I didn't empty it, just enough to leave a strong, undeniable scent, and to ensure that the gas fumes would saturate the air right outside their sleeping bags. Then I moved. I didn't follow Sarah up to the Sentinel Point. That was their trap. Instead, I moved in the opposite direction, down the trail we had just come from, moving as fast and quietly as my fear would allow. I was maybe 100 yards down the path when I heard the sound I was waiting for, the crunch of Sarah's boots returning to camp. She would be annoyed by the fuel smell. She would be annoyed by the disruption. And she would check my tent, confirming I was still asleep. I found a sharp, fist-sized rock and threw it hard, not into the camp, but into a cluster of dry logs a bit further off the trail, maybe 50 feet beyond their tents. A loud, dry crack of wood on wood. A second later, I heard Liam's panicked shout, followed by the immediate aggressive sound of Sarah's voice. "Liam, what was that? What did you do?" I knew the tension was breaking them. They were already suspicious of each other. The unexpected sound, combined with the strong smell of gas, would put them instantly on edge. I didn't wait to see the outcome. I started running. I ran for 10 minutes until I was gasping for air, ignoring the pain in my shins and the brush tearing at my exposed arms. I finally collapsed in a thicket of brush beneath an enormous downed tree. I was still miles from the nearest road, freezing and alone, but I had a head start. When I looked back up the trail, I saw a faint, unsettling flicker of orange light rise briefly above the distant trees, quickly followed by a strange, dull roar. Then, immediate darkness and silence. I didn't know if they had tried to use their stove near the leaking fuel, or if a fight had caused the explosion, but I knew I was safe from them. I was free, running on the energy of the betrayal that had nearly cost me my life. I had turned their isolation and their secrets into my own escape plan. I kept running toward the first light of morning, knowing that whatever illegal deal they were making at Sentinel Point, they wouldn't have time to complete it now. They were too busy dealing with the inferno I left behind. I was 4 days into a brutal, beautiful section of the Continental Divide Trail. I'd planned meticulously, but the heat had been relentless, and I was dangerously low on water and, more critically, blister treatment. My original itinerary had me bypassing all civilization, but the pain in my feet forced me to take a 2-mile detour down a dusty, winding access road to a place marked on the old map as Haven's End, General Store and Gas. It was a town that time forgot. A single, dusty road ran through the center, flanked by a handful of dilapidated trailers and 2 brick buildings, a sagging post office and the Haven's End Mercantile. The air was silent, heavy, and smelled like dry hay and old oil. I pulled off my pack and hobbled toward the store's screen door. Inside, the light was dim and yellow, and the silence was broken only by the loud, persistent buzzing of a fly. Behind the counter was an older woman with thin, iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun. She didn't look up from her crossword puzzle. "Can I get a bottle of water and maybe some medical tape?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful. She slowly placed her pencil down, her eyes, pale and unnervingly bright, finally fixed on me. "Hiker," she stated, not asked. "We don't get many of your kind here anymore. Most of them stick to the main road." "I took a detour," I explained, pulling out my wallet. "You look tired," she said, leaning slightly closer. "Why rush? We have a nice little motel room out back. Clean. You could rest up, get a hot meal." I hesitated. I was desperate for a shower, but the motel looked like it hadn't seen a paying guest since the 1980s. "No, thank you. I need to get back on the trail before dark." She gave a small, cryptic smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Oh, you'll be staying, honey. It's too late to hike out now." I bought the water and the tape, paid in cash, and started to leave. As I walked toward the door, I noticed 3 men sitting silently at a rickety table in the corner, staring at me. They weren't drinking coffee or chatting, they were just observing. Their eyes followed my every move, and they didn't acknowledge me, not even with a nod. I pushed open the door and stepped back onto the dusty road, my anxiety spiking. The whole place felt wrong, like a set piece waiting for the curtain to rise. I quickly checked my boots and started power walking toward the access road, determined to put Haven's End in my rearview mirror. But as I reached the junction, I saw a large, faded road closed sign leaning against a fence post. I knew that sign hadn't been there when I walked in. I looked at the road, and sure enough, a rusted metal gate, previously open, was now tightly shut and secured with a heavy chain. I spun around. The 3 men from the store were already standing 50 yards behind me, blocking the path back to the mercantile. They hadn't run, they had just materialized, fast and silent. "Going somewhere?" one of them asked, his voice low and mocking. My heart hammered. This wasn't a random blockade. This was coordinated. "I need to get back to the trail," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my hands were already sweating. "There's no reason to close the road." "There is tonight," the second man said. "We have business here, and we don't want anyone stumbling in on it, especially not a pretty hiker with a fancy pack." They started walking toward me, slow and deliberate. I took a few steps back, my eyes darting desperately between the locked gate, the surrounding fence line, and the men closing the distance. I was trapped between 2 high fences and 3 increasingly aggressive men. I backed up until I hit the rough metal of the gate. I grabbed my hiking pole, extending it fully, trying to put distance between us. "Stay back," I warned. "I'll call the sheriff." The third man laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "The sheriff is Betty's nephew. You already met Betty, didn't you? She's waiting for you back at the motel." The realization settled deep in my bones. The entire town was in on whatever sinister activity was happening here. I wasn't facing opportunists. I was facing a community of conspirators. I didn't try to run at them. I knew I couldn't fight them. I was trapped and the darkness was creeping in. I looked at the gate again. The chain was heavy, but the old, faded lock looked weak. I jammed the pointed end of my trekking pole through the shackle of the lock and twisted with all the strength and adrenaline I could muster. The cheap metal groaned and bent, but didn't break. The men saw what I was doing and rushed forward. "Stop her! Get the keys!" I abandoned the pole and scrambled up the fence post, ignoring the barbed wire tearing at my hands and legs. The fence was maybe 10 feet high. As I reached the top, the first man grabbed my boot, yanking hard. My foot slipped out, and I felt my pack shift violently. I kicked down, connecting hard with his shoulder. I scrambled over the top, dropping down hard on the other side of the gate, tumbling onto the rough asphalt of the closed road. "She's over the fence! Go through the store and get the truck!" I heard one of them shout, his voice laced with venom. I knew they were going to drive down the inside of the fence line, and then unlock the gate ahead of me, catching me in a pincer movement. I couldn't run down the road. I had to ditch the road entirely. I spotted a very steep, densely wooded hillside right next to the fence. It was too rough for a truck and too steep for a quick pursuit. I pushed myself up and into the trees, leaving the closed road immediately. I ran upward, slipping on the loose dirt and grasping at the roots and trunks of the pines. I could hear the roar of an old engine starting back near the mercantile. They were coming, and they were going to drive the perimeter of their property to cut me off. I kept climbing for 20 brutal minutes until I reached a rocky ridge overlooking the road. I was gasping. My clothes were torn and my hands were bleeding, but I stopped only when I knew I was above the level of the fence line. I saw the old pickup truck come roaring down the dirt road, its headlights cutting violently through the trees. They stopped at the locked gate, and the headlights shone directly onto the spot where I had climbed the fence. They knew I was gone. They paused for a moment, and I heard the sound of an aggressive, desperate horn blast. It was a signal to the whole town. I waited until the truck slowly backed up, turning around to scour the road for tracks. Then, I turned my back to the valley of Haven's End, climbed over the ridge, and started hiking through the dense, hostile wilderness again. It was a terrible, terrifying detour, but I had made it out of their compound. I had escaped the polite, coordinated trap of that awful little town. I never looked back. I knew that the danger in Haven's End wasn't just a threat, it was a way of life, and I was just one more traveler who almost disappeared into its deadly hospitality. I was taking a cold-weather backpacking trip in the high Rockies, aiming for a chain of remote alpine lakes. On the evening of the second day, I reached the last designated campsite before the major ascent. It was a cluster of 3 cleared pads tucked away in the pine line. 2 of the pads were empty. The third, however, had a tent already set up, a small utilitarian green dome tent. It was fully zipped, but completely silent. I didn't see a pack, a fire, or any sign of the occupant. Maybe they're just out getting water, I thought. It was getting late, so I set up my own camp 20 feet away, giving them space. I cooked my dehydrated dinner and watched the last light drain out of the sky. Around 9 p.m., I realized something was wrong. The tent was still zipped up, still silent, and no one had returned. A hiker wouldn't leave their gear unattended, and their tent zipped for this long, especially in the freezing alpine air. I felt a creeping sense of dread. I grabbed my headlamp and my knife and walked toward the silent tent. "Hello?" I called out, tapping the fly gently with my boot. "Is anyone in there? Are you all right?" Silence. Only the sound of the wind rushing through the needles. I knelt down and unzipped the vestibule flap just a few inches. The stench that hit me was immediate and sickening, a heavy, metallic, sweet smell that I instantly recognized as dried blood. I risked shining my headlamp into the darkness. Inside, crumpled near the back wall, was a person. They were motionless, covered in a dirty sleeping bag. But what made me gasp was the pool of dark, viscous liquid staining the tent floor, slowly seeping into the dirt beneath the ground cover. The person was dead. They had been dead for hours. And based on the violent scene, this wasn't an accidental death. I immediately backed away, heart pounding so violently it felt like it would tear through my chest. I had to get away from the camp, but first, I had to alert someone. I reached for my satellite messenger, which was clipped to my pack 20 feet away. Just as my fingers closed around the plastic shell, I saw it. Tucked tightly under the flap of the dead hiker's tent vestibule, completely missed by my first hasty inspection, was a large, military-grade dry bag. It was heavy, rigid, and sealed tight. It wasn't standard hiking gear. I hesitated, knowing I shouldn't touch anything, but my curiosity, mingled with the horrible knowledge of the crime, won out. I dragged the heavy bag out. It felt like bricks inside. I unrolled the seal and shone my light in. It wasn't bricks. It was money. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in banded, shrink-wrapped stacks of cash. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a random crime. This was a robbery, a deal gone bad, a desperate exchange. The hiker was killed for this bag, or maybe they were the one carrying it. I immediately sealed the bag back up and shoved it into the bottom of my own pack, burying it under my sleeping bag. I knew I couldn't leave it there, not if I was going to call the police. I had stumbled onto the motive. I finally got my satellite messenger out. It took 3 agonizing minutes to acquire the signal, but just as the confirmation light blinked green, I heard the sound I dreaded, the muffled roar of an engine being cut far down the main access road, followed by the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel trail. The perpetrators were coming back. They had realized they left the money. I grabbed my pack, now weighted with the horrifying discovery, and ran. I didn't try to hide the tents. I left my camp, the dead hikers' camp, and the satellite communicator where it was, flashing green with the emergency SOS signal. I plunged into the dense, dark woods behind the campsites, moving away from the trail toward a sheer, rocky embankment. My heavy pack made me clumsy, but I had to keep the money. It was the only evidence, and maybe the only leverage I had. I reached the embankment and started a precarious descent, using the weak light of my headlamp to find footholds. From the camp above, I heard their shouts, two voices, harsh and panicked. "It's gone. The tent is open. The money is gone." Did the victim move it? Where's the hiker's pack? They quickly found my deserted camp. Then, one of them found the still blinking satellite messenger. "She called it in. They know," one of them screamed, his voice thick with fury. "Find the trail. She can't be far. She has the bag." I heard them scramble for the trail, assuming I had fled along the path. I had a few minutes. I finally reached the bottom of the embankment, landing in a ravine thick with brush and loose soil. I kept moving until I hit the dry creek bed that ran parallel to the main trail, giving me a silent, hidden corridor. I had covered maybe half a mile when I heard a high-powered flashlight beam cut through the darkness above the ravine. They had split up and were searching the perimeter. "We know you have it," a voice echoed down the ravine. "Drop the bag and walk back up, and we'll forget we ever saw you. You keep that cash, and you're just as guilty as we are." He knew the power of the money, the absolute, crushing temptation. It was a perfect, insidious form of blackmail. I kept moving, desperate, but I had to slow down. I couldn't outrun them with the heavy pack. I stopped near a massive, uprooted tree. I pulled the dry bag out, looked at the stacks of cold, silent money, and made a decision. I didn't throw the bag. Instead, I grabbed my smallest knife and slashed a clean, small hole in the very bottom corner of the dry bag. Then, I put the heavy bag back in my pack and continued moving quickly down the ravine. A minute later, I looked behind me. I couldn't see them, but I saw what I needed to see. A faint, fluttering trail of white and green paper currency, a few scattered dollar bills, leading directly behind me in the darkness. I was leaving a literal breadcrumb trail of cash. I continued for another 5 minutes, creating a long, irresistible scent trail of easy money. Then, I scrambled up the side of the ravine, hiding my pack and myself in a dense patch of pines. Moments later, I heard their frantic shouts turn into greedy, excited yelps. "I found some! Over here! She dropped it! There's more! She's bleeding money! She must have cut the bag!" Their focus immediately shifted from hunting me to gathering the scattered cash. The blackmailer's dilemma was working against them. The sight of easy, discarded money was a more powerful distraction than their need for revenge. I waited until their headlamps were focused exclusively on the ground, shining back up the ravine, chasing the trail of cash I had left. With painful silence, I turned off my headlamp, left the ravine completely, and started bushwhacking through the freezing dark woods toward the rising sun. I was alive, and the people who killed the hiker were now distracted by their own greed. I never got the money back, and I never went back to claim my pack. But I had escaped the ambush, knowing I had forced the killers to choose between chasing me and cleaning up the valuable mess I had engineered. I had escaped, leaving them to their avarice and the inevitable arrival of the police, who were now tracking the signal from the silent camp above.